Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot and welcome to another mod with me. Today we're going to be trimming and edging my new copy of the Druid Craft Tarot. So I do already have a copy of the Druid Craft Tarot and I have already modified it. This particular deck was modified pre-measurement days. So when I just used to throw the card in a trimmer, chop off all the sides and then move on to the next card. And you can see here that that gets a really uneven trim. And that uneven trim also really affects the shuffling. And I trimmed it down to be completely borderless, which I do love. One of the things about this deck is that it does very much follow the Rider-Waite-Smith. And so it's very easy to tell what card is what if you're familiar with that system, even without any of the titles on it. And I think it's actually a great size borderless like this. But one of the things that I have really been wanting is the big box version with the big book, because this is the small box version. It came in a box that was about deck size. Now, bearing in mind, I've trimmed this down, so the box was a little bit bigger, and it just had a small guidebook in it, which is totally fine. But I've heard that the big guidebook for the full-size edition is really wonderful, and so I just wanted to have a copy of that in my collection. Because, you know, I do enjoy my guidebooks almost as much as I enjoy my decks. And so I thought it was time to probably just go ahead and get this. I just picked it up at my local Barnes & Noble. I was in there one day and saw it and thought there was only one copy left, so it was fate. So I went ahead and grabbed that, which we'll take a look at here in a moment. And I decided that I'm going to go ahead and trim that one down. And the reason that I'm going to do that is, for one, I've heard that they're two different cardstocks, so we'll find out about that here in a minute. For two, I just wanted to share with you the process that I used or would use now for trimming the Druid Craft Tarot, because I thought that might be helpful. I know a lot of people like to trim this deck, so I just wanted to do a quick little kind of tutorial on how I would do it so that you can follow along if that's something that you're interested in. And another thing that I started doing with this deck is that I've started painting the cards. Now I do have a whole video on how I've done this. Let me bring them in so hopefully we can see. Can you see everywhere where it's picking up that kind of metallic shimmer? I know these lights really aren't the best for this, but everywhere it's picking up a metallic shimmer is places where I have overlaid with paint. Now I'm not changing the color or anything. I'm just like kind of metallic gilding my own deck with different colored metallic paints. I have done quite a few of the cards. I mean, I've done like the leaves and the flowers and just anywhere where I really wanted to draw attention to something, I added a layer of metallic paint in a matching color. So I'm not changing the design, I'm not changing the colors or anything. I'm just adding that kind of almost like a metallic overlay, a metallic, what do they call that? The cold stamping, but it's not, right? It's like faux cold stamping, and I'm using different colors. So I have green and I have browns and I have yellows and purples and blues and whites. I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but like the clouds have pearlescent white paint in them. And so this is a process that I've been doing with this deck. Now I do still use this deck and read with this deck, but I thought since I had a second copy, I can go ahead and just put this deck aside as this particular painting project. And that when I'm finally done with it, because as you can see, like this is what I've got done. This is what I have left to do. So, you know, I've got quite a few cards left to do and I'm not really in a hurry. This is just something that I do when I feel like painting, but I don't really want to think about it too much and I just really want to spend some time, you know, hanging out with this deck. Then I just take one of the cards and I get out all my little paints and I repaint them. This is one of my favorites. I don't know if it'll catch up. Her dress has pearlescent white. We have gold flecks. We have bronze in the pentacles. This is just one of my favorite cards anyway, but I had a lot of fun repainting it. So now that I have another copy of the Druid Craft that I can use just for actual readings, I can set this one aside as a art project and let it just kind of be that for a while until I get done painting all these cards. So one of the things that I've kind of been curious about is I have heard that there is different cardstock in this edition. And so I'm curious to see how that is, but again, this was really what I was after, this big book. I thought it would be really wonderful to have the big guidebook. So that's the main reason why I got the deck. And then I thought, well, since I have it, let's just go ahead and modify it because then I can have a working deck and an art deck that I'm working with. So I can tell you right now, these are totally different cardstock. And this painting project that I'm doing would not have worked on this cardstock because this cardstock is actually more glossy and this is more like cardboardy. So I'm not sure how I feel about that, to be perfectly honest. It's not like full on like Schiffer gloss, but it is definitely much glossier. It's picking up all my fingerprints. It's thinner. It's a much thinner cardstock. This is actually more like cardboard. You can see the design is the same, and this version is quite a bit lighter. Let's grab the Fool out because I think I have him here just so we can see if there's any printing differences. I know this is a mod video, not a comparison, but I just kind of want to see because this is obviously the first time I'm looking at it. So it looks like the printing is just a little bit darker on this big box edition than it is on the small box edition. So far, I'm not wild about this cardstock, but that just could be because I've been using this one for so long that I'm partial to this cardboardy cardstock. Again, this would not work for this art project, so I'm actually glad that I got this one first to do the art project with. I'm really not loving this cardstock. Yeah, I can't even get my hands around this. Like, I legit cannot get my hands around this to even try to shuffle it. We'll see if I could corner shuffle it. Again, I'm not, yeah, that's just a hot mess. So with any luck, it'll shuffle better. Like it's even really big this way for me to try and do this. It's very slippy too. It's very slippy. It's very different than this edition. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the different trim options that you have with a deck like this. Because this deck actually has double border, so we have basically the border that contains the artwork and the title, which is then kind of plunked down in the center of the card, although as you'll see when we're trimming, it's actually not center. I can look at this card and even tell you just by looking at it that the artwork is shifted more to the left, and that will vary from card to card based on the printing, and perhaps might be one of the reasons why they like to do the borders, because they can just kind of plunk the image down in the center and they don't have to worry about trying to cut and align things in any particular way. But some of the options that you have is of course just to take the white border off and leave the green border with the titles. That is definitely something that I've seen people do, and it does look quite nice that way, particularly if you wanted to retain the borders or retain the title work on this particular deck. So, however, this deck is so Rider-Waite-Smith that I don't think that you would have any trouble if you know that system working with this deck without the titles. The other thing that I have seen people do is go ahead and cut off the 3 sides, the top and the 2 sides, green border and all, and just leave the titles, so you can see here, would basically end up looking like that, where you still retain the titles and you just have kind of a green bar at top and a green bar at bottom. So you cut everything off this way, and then you just cut to the green border here. Now that does make your back a little bit off-centered, but with a card like this, I don't think that's really gonna matter because the design is so minimal that I don't think it's gonna be a big deal. Look at this Princess of Cups. She's one of my favorites in this deck. She's beautiful. Okay, so I think that's probably what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and probably take it down borderless, but like I said, I'm gonna start with the 2 sides in the top first and leave that title area for last, just so that I can make that final decision when it comes time. And because I trim these one side at a time to ensure that they are as close to this kind of cut, this machine cut. So that's machine cut. This is what happens when you trim without measurements. You can see they're all different heights, and even the sides are all different. So we'll see how close I can get that with a measurement and guillotine cut. And I always say measurements, but I don't actually use measurements. I use little guides to cheat that because I don't want to actually measure the card every time. But it's basically cutting all the cards at the same width on each side every time. And that's what helps you get that more uniform trim. Okay, so enough babbling. Let's clear some space and get started. Okay, so I've got all my tools out here, and before we jump in, I'll just share with you real quick what I have. I do have a complete video on all my deck mod tools that I use. If you want to check that out, I'll leave that linked in the description box below for you. But I, of course, have my Fisker's trimmer that I'm going to be using. I have my Katamaro Pro corner rounder for when we're done to round those corners. And I have my little triangle ruler to create the guide and some washi tape to hold that guide in place. Here's the rest of it. And then of course I also have, because I always forget every time, to grab out my ruler, which just helps me eyeball where the actual blade is going to come down. So those are all the basic tools I use, including my deck. And we'll talk edging and colors and all of that when we get to that point, because a lot of times I don't make that decision until I've actually trimmed the deck, because then I've spent some time with it. I did trim my original one in like a copper color, and while that's really beautiful, I might do something different this time just to do something different. So let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do is basically do my same process that I do. So if you've watched any of my mod with me's or my more recent ones in the last year or two, this is the same process that I follow each and every time, where I'm basically gonna cut all of the right side off the deck first, then all of the left side, the top, and then I come back and do the bottom, and cutting one side at a time, like all the cards on one side at a time, helps you get that uniform cut, which also helps you to create a smoother trim, which oftentimes shuffles better. So what I'm gonna do basically is get my card in here and see where I wanna line it up. That is really close to the edge. And here's the thing, remember how I talked about the printing shifting? So if I put this card in here and it's good right where we're at, and I put this card in here, they could end up at different spots. So sometimes by pressing down on the card and then sliding your ruler up there, your little corner ruler, you can get that a little bit straighter. So now I can look and actually see and make sure that the line on the board showing behind the ruler is actually straight, which it looks like it is. Most of the time using this process, if I don't get a deck straight, it's because my ruler wasn't straight to start with. And that has happened to me quite a few times. Okay, so now I am going into that border quite a bit. The other thing I do want to keep in mind in case I am deciding to keep those titles is that I need to be mindful of titles that are taking up this whole space, because if I put this one in here and I trim this card down, I am going to be getting just on the other side of that S, and it's going to be really, really close. Like to the point where I think I can even scoot it just a little bit more. So now I'm kind of just pulling a couple of different cards from different areas in the deck, because that one is sitting right up against that green border, whereas these cards are taking a little bit more off. So I can't really go any further to the right because I'm gonna end up cutting or leaving some of that green border. So we're just gonna, because I'm pretty sure I'm not gonna worry about the titles, I'm not gonna worry about it, right? So I'm just gonna put this in here, and we're just gonna go with it. That was kind of why I checked a couple of different cards, because I wanted to make sure that it was gonna actually cut off all the green border, which is what I want. Because on these cards, the printing is shifted more to the right. So I'm taking off the green border and a slight sliver of the artwork. And on this card, the printing is shifted a little bit more to the left. So it's just hitting just inside that green border. And hopefully when I cut the slivers off, maybe that'll make sense. But it's just something to keep in mind, again, because that printing does shift. So I'm gonna hold the card down and I'm gonna bring my blade straight down. Always important to make sure you're bringing your blade straight down too. And there we go, we have the first side cut off, and I took the green border off and everything. So hopefully you can see here, if I can get my camera to focus for you. This has just the green border with that inside drop shadow, Okay, now let's take a look at where this one's gonna hit. Again, I haven't moved my measurements, haven't moved my guides. I'm just putting the card in there at the same exact spot. And I'm bringing my blade down nice and straight. And can you see with this one, how I got not only the green border, the drop shadow, but I also got a little bit of the artwork, which you can see down here at the bottom where we have some of that. I think that's part of the rock. But can you see the difference? And that's not me moving the trimmer any, right? That's the variances in the printing and how much they shift. So that's just something to keep in mind. It does maybe kind of sound like I'm not gonna get like an even deck out of the end of it, but because I'm using the measurements and the cradle and the guide, it will be pretty much the same size. And I always like to say as humanly possible, because there is no way to get a machine cut by hand, no matter how good you are and what kind of tools you have. So there's the rebirth card. And again, you can see with that one, I cut off just the tiniest bit of the artwork and the border. So I'm gonna go ahead and basically trim off the 3 sides and the top and just basically repeat the same process across all the cards. I'm going to trim off this right side. And then when I get done doing that on all of these cards, I will basically flip the deck around, reset to this so that it's now gonna be probably over here somewhere. And I'll move this triangle ruler here and make another guide for the other side. Then I'll cut that whole side off and then I'll repeat the process for the top. And that's basically the whole process that I'm gonna follow throughout the whole deck, doing one side at a time. And then we'll check back in and take a look at what it ended up looking like, cutting the 3 sides off and just leaving the title area at the bottom. I'm pretty sure I'm gonna take it off, but you know, I always like to check it first because I never know until I get to that point. Point in case with my Dreaming Way Tarot, I really thought I was gonna take that down completely borderless. I did the 2 sides and the top, and then I realized that I really liked the title on the bottom, so I left it. So that's the reason why I always do the title areas last, because that has happened in the past where I've decided to leave the title area. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish trimming up these 3 sides and then we'll check back in. Okay, so I have got the deck trimmed down to all 3 of the sides taken off, and I have left the white on the bottom just because I want to take a minute before I kind of trim this to think about what I might want to do with this deck. Do I want to leave the titles on? And so what I'm kind of doing first is to just take a quick flip through and make sure that I didn't accidentally cut anything off that should have remained, because I really didn't think I was going to keep the titles, so I wasn't paying too much attention to it. I think it was really just the princesses that were the issue. Yeah, there's a Princess of Pentacles. So you can see that I've got it like right up against the end there on both sides, but I can still read it. So I'm kind of just going to take a minute, and while I kind of take a minute and think about that, one of the things that I want to show you real quick is, so here's the sides. Let me just lay them all down here flat. And now I've got that pretty dang straight, pretty dang flat, right? But if you look at the top looks kind of jaggedy, and that is because what I did, and sometimes I will cheat the top this way, is that I just put these cards in my trimmer and I did the one thing that I always tell you not to do, and that is to just stick it in here and go, that looks about right, and chop it off. Now, the reason that I did that is because when you're using the measurements like this, I can fix this by being really precise with my cuts down here. And so sometimes I will kind of cheat the process, and I'll do that where I'll cut the tops just right along where I think I need them to be, and then I'll be a lot more precise with the bottoms. Part of that is because this is a larger deck, and sometimes, you know, anything that is over 5 inches, a little bit hard to fit into my trimmer. Yes, I could get a bigger trimmer, I know, but I like this one. I like the way it cuts, and I don't really want to mess with a big, huge trimmer on my desk. This is the point in the mod where I have to like really decide, what do I want to do? Do I want to keep those bottom titles or do I want to take them off? And as I'm looking at it, even though I'm not looking at the same cards, although I could have totally done that as well. And now that I'm looking at it like this, I'm just really not a fan of the font that they used. I think if they had used a little bit more of a plain font, I might be more inclined to keep it on there, but I think it just is actually a little bit hard to read, and I don't think it really adds anything design-wise to the cards. Again, this is all totally my personal preference. And I just think these cards look so beautiful borderless. It like takes away any distraction so that you can really just focus in on the artwork. And so given that, I think I'm going to go ahead and do this one completely borderless as well, because remember, even though I have this one, for one, it's a totally different cardstock, which I have to say, I still like this better. I guess I'm just old school. I don't even know how old this deck is. It's several years old at this point, but I guess I'm old school and I just like the older cardstock better. This is the version, because I think I forgot to say, by St. Martin's, because I do think this deck has been released by many different publishers. So this is the St. Martin's version, the March 2019 edition. So still a couple years old. You would probably get even a newer one if you ordered it from, say, like Amazon, but I just bought it at the local bookstore, so it was probably, could have been stock from 2019 for all we know, right? So anyway, now that I've kind of taken a minute to think about that, and yeah, I'm pretty sure once I see the cards all laid out, and sometimes it takes me actually laying the cards out and just taking a few minutes to, like, if I were doing a reading, right, what would they look like? And I think if I were doing a reading with this deck, I would want it to be completely borderless. For one, that's kind of what I'm familiar with in working with the deck I already have. And two, I just think it looks stunning borderless, although I'm not loving this cardstock. I'm just gonna be honest about that. So anyway, what I'm going to do at this point now is go ahead and trim the last side off. So I'm going to go ahead and trim those titles off. And again, I'm just going to repeat that same process that I've been doing all along. And we'll see how straight I can get everything. And as I mentioned, I noticed that when I was trimming the tops off, that these cards were in there like really crooked. I mean, the printing is really crooked, not the cards themselves. And that's common. That's not like a dig against the printer or anything. That's just super common with printing. It's hard to get things exact every single time. And these are printed in, you know, these are mass market, so they're printed in probably super large runs. But anyway, I've got this lined up here, and I'm just going to like double check that it is actually straight, because sometimes I don't get it in there totally straight. And like I said, when a deck ends up crooked, it's usually because my ruler wasn't straight. Because even though I can pop it up against here and get it straight, I do still have to make sure that it's like actually in there straight, right? I don't just trust my first stick it down is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so that's looking good to me. You know, I can use my ruler too, but sometimes you can just kind of eyeball it with where the blade is, because I know if I stick my ruler here, it's gonna freak my camera out because I have my camera really close right now. But that one is good. And again, like always, I'm gonna check a couple because the printing could be totally different. Yeah, my measurements are looking good so far. All right, okay, so basically what I'm gonna do is go ahead and finish trimming this entire deck. Okay, real quick before I corner around it, I have taken the final title off, the final side, and I've saved some extra here for some edging purposes. But I wanted to show you before I corner rounded it, there is what it looks like. Now, I did get one card that slipped on me, and I think that one right there. Oh, no, this one. It's that tower. So the tower slipped on me as I was trimming, and so it ended up getting a little bit shorter than the rest. It's in the middle of the deck, you can kind of see it, but like if I put it right there, you can kind of see it. But outside of the tower card, the rest of them are all pretty much the same. Now, if that really, really bothered me, I could measure the tower card right? And funny that it's the Tower. Where'd it go? I could put this back in my trimmer and I could set the measurements to this particular card, right? Because it went and slipped on me. Dang it. And I could recut all these cards down to the size of the Tower, right? Because I accidentally cut that one too short. Okay, the fingerprints are kind of bugging me. Look at that. That's awful. But anyway, I don't care that much. And I think it's kind of funny that the Tower is the one card that slipped and ended up getting a little bit more of a haircut than I intended. I feel like that was maybe supposed to happen. So I'm going to leave it. But if that bothered me, and if I really, really wanted this deck to be extremely uniform, I could go back and trim all those cards using the measurement now that I have on the Tower, which is just a sliver shorter than the rest of them. I, however, don't care enough to take the time to actually do that, and I think it's fine, and I'm going to leave that Tower being a little bit of a stubby guy. So now I'm going to go ahead and round the corners. So while I have you here, I guess we'll just go ahead and do a little testing. So I'm going to use my little title scraps here to test my rounders. I almost always end up using the medium. You can kind of see on the top of the Tombow Pro, it kind of shows you what it looks like. I think that I might have used the large on this one. Oh no, I lied. I used the medium, which I think is plenty. I think a lot of times if I rarely use the large one because that makes it really, really rounded, and it really softens a deck. So if I'm trying to soften a deck, then I will use the extra rounded large. But in general, I tend to just use the medium for anything that's kind of standard tarot size, the large one for maybe really big oracles, or if I'm trying to really soften a deck up. This is not a deck that I really want to soften, so I'm probably going to stick with the medium. The small one, just to show you here, is really great for like your mini decks, because see, it's a really small, that doesn't really show up very well on where the texture is, but it's a really, really small corner. So you can kind of see, hopefully, the difference is there, but I'm going to go ahead and just use the medium one. I'm going to save those for some edging things, and we're going to take our stubby Tower and we're going to corner round it. And there you go. That's what it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and finish corner rounding the rest of the deck, and then we'll talk about colors. So I've got my deck all trimmed and corner rounded, and it does look pretty great. I mean, I do really love this deck borderless. It really just, you know, as we say, makes the artwork pop. So now I'm going to go ahead and edge it because I think that just really helps finish the deck off nicely. Here's what the backs ended up looking like, which I think the same thing happened on this deck. Yes, it did, where the emblem on the back ended up shifting more down towards the bottom. And again, that's just because there's more title area down here, right? And I cut off more of the bottom of the card than I did the top. But you can see that it kind of puts it closer to the bottom of the card, so it's not really center anymore. That really doesn't bother me at all, but it is something to keep in mind in case you know, really are picky about your backs. One of the things that I was kind of trying to do was decide what color I want to edge this in. So I kind of picked out like all my little earthy Tombow colors. After kind of looking at all these different colors and kind of swatching them out, I think I'm going to go with this 098. And the thing is that it does kind of match, if you can see here, it does kind of match the emblem a little bit on the back, and I really wanted to pull that green color in because there is so much green in this deck. And I did do a couple of test swatches here. So of course these are not all the same height, but I did test swatch it here on my little extra pieces just so I could see what the color would look like on the card. It is always darker on the card than it looks on paper. And I also just kind of wanted to see how it covered and whether or not I got any bleed, and it doesn't look like it did. So it stayed in place really well. So I'm basically going to go ahead and edge this whole deck in this particular color. I think any of these colors would have probably worked pretty pretty well. I mean, given that the majority of these colors are actually in the deck. So I've got my Tombow marker here at my deck. I have some paper towels here. The paper towel method isn't really as required with the Tombows that I found, but I do like to give it a wipe down just to make sure any excess comes off. So what I'm gonna do is hold the card back to me so that if I run off the card, I'm gonna run off onto the back and not the front of my card. So I'm just gonna take this and I'm going to basically color my card in. I do 2 passes across the card just to kind of fill it in pretty well. But I have definitely seen people do it with just 1. But I like it to be really, really filled in. So then I take my paper towel and I just kind of go along the edge just to make sure I'm getting off any excess that might be just hanging out on top of the card. Particularly with a glossy card, sometimes you can get some excess that is hanging out on the gloss there, and it's just gonna end up on your hands if you don't kind of get it off. So that's my basic process for edging with a marker. It's not fancy. It's actually pretty quick and easy in comparison. Okay, I've got a little less than half of the deck edged. It's been almost 10 minutes, and I just thought I would kind of do a little check-in to see where it's at. So here is the unedged and the edged. Okay, so maybe I'm not quite half, but I do think this color is really cool. I really, really like it, and I think it does look pretty good with the backs here. It almost makes the gold emblem look a little bit more green, which is kind of cool. So I thought I'd just kind of show that halfway point, or okay, not quite halfway, but this is what it looks like after 2 coats of the Tombow green. Not 2 coats, really. 1 coat, 2 passes. Is that 1 coat or 2? I don't know, but it's 2 passes on each side, if that helps. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish this up. So I have finished trimming and edging my big box version of the Druid Craft Tarot. I absolutely love this deck borderless. Like I said, I already had a borderless edition, but that one is now going to be solely dedicated to the painting project that I'm doing with it. And this one I can now go ahead and use for just my regular readings. Not that I wasn't using that one before, it still totally works even though I've got paint on it, but it is kind of nice to be able to just put that one aside and to just continue working through the painting of the cards. And I just wanted to share with you how I would trim this deck now that I have a second copy of it. So again, this is the big box version, and I think it looks absolutely beautiful, borderless. I did end up just edging it in the Tombow 098 in this green color. You can see the cap, as I've mentioned before, it never is the same color that it is on the deck, so you kind of have to get kind of used to that and eyeball it. So here's my original one. This one was trimmed without measurements. This one was trimmed with. So you can see there's quite the difference in, if I can get my hands all the way around these cards, in how straight they are, right? These ones are nice and flush, kind of like almost machine cut, and these ones you can see all the ridges in them. So let's do it this way. There's a huge difference there. Let's go ahead and give it a shuffle, and I'm just kind of curious to see how it shuffles. Also, we'll see how a different trim shuffles. So it is still quite stiff because it's new, but you can see I got quite the nice mix in there. It doesn't really bridge back together real well, but it definitely is easier for me to handle. It's super slippery. I'm not loving the cardstock. I'm just going to be honest about that. As you can see, it's sliding all over the place. It's catching my lights. It's just, I'm just not a fan of glossy cardstock. However, it's, totally usable, so I'm not going to complain too much. I can riffle shuffle it. The more I do this, the more it'll break in. Because again, this is a new deck. I'm also not wild about the fingerprints. Can you see that? Like, there's my light. Fingerprints all over this. I don't have that issue with this deck. But let me just show you with this deck, because it's not trimmed very well, as in it's not straight, it doesn't really shuffle very well. And that is mostly because my fingers, because all the cards are different sizes, my fingers are catching on some cards over others. And so it really creates that big clumping effect. Even though, of course, it's different cardstock, it's not quite as flexible as this cardstock, but actually, this feels like it might even be a little bit thicker. But the reason it's not shuffling well, and if you have trouble shuffling a deck that you've trimmed, it could be because when you go to riffle shuffle it, I can feel right here, these larger cards, my thumb is catching on those. And so it's gonna make all the smaller cards behind it just kind of flop out like that. And so that's real common with a deck that's been trimmed to a deck that's been trimmed, not using, you know, not getting it super straight. And that's not to say that I don't have decks that are like that, like my favorite deck, my Llewellyn. Can I mention my Llewellyn? Because I haven't mentioned my Llewellyn in this video. You know, was trimmed in the exact same way, and I love it regardless, so I wouldn't change a thing about it. But actually, this deck is pretty slippy too. Maybe it's just been a while since I've worked with this. It's kind of wanting to slip all over as well. But anyway, the trimming does make a big difference in the shuffling. And I know some people say like, oh, once you trim a deck, it never shuffles right. That's actually not the case in my experience. It's not that the deck has issue shuffling, it's that when you trim it and it's uneven, your fingers catch on all these bigger cards, and then it makes the smaller cards kind of fumble around behind it, if that makes sense. So when you get them all nice and straight, there's nothing really for your finger to catch on, and they have a tendency to fall a little bit nicer, right? So just a little note there about trimming and why I think it's really important to kind of use those measurements and do things so to get it as straight as possible if you're going to riffle shuffle. If you're going to overhand, it doesn't matter. You can still overhand a wonky trim deck just as well. So let's throw a couple cards down just so we can see how pretty this looks. I love this deck. This is one of those workhorse decks, right? I can throw it down, I can use it for anything, and it works beautifully for me. I will be curious to see how I feel about working with it with the different cardstock, because like I said, I've had my old one for quite some time, and I'm quite like, it has a certain feel to it, right? It feels like my Druid Craft in my hand. I'm not sure that this is gonna feel exactly the same, but you know, I never know until I get a chance to really work with it. But I think borderless like that, that's just beautiful. Except for the gloss. Not a fan of that. But anyway, there we go. Another deck modded. Thank you so much for joining me for this mod with me of the Druid Craft Tarot. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.